Thanks for coming. I'm Fred. It's my new book, Bourbon, the Rise, Fall, and the Rebirth of American Whiskey. The chapter I'm reading is Chapter 11, To Beat Jack Daniels. Moving into the 1990s, bourbon conceded the vodka fight and realized there was just no competing with a product so drastically different. Their 1970s efforts to compete with vodka were failures, and the bourbon category steadily lost market share to white goods in the 1980s. Despite continuous efforts to promote bourbon as a mixer and lowering proofs to match the 80-proof vodkas, the 1990s would be a time of category discovery and one of massive company making all the wrong decisions. In 1991, the United Distillers Company, now parent of the Schinley Company, announced a $20 million investment into the Old Fitzgerald and Bernheim distilleries. The effort intended to revitalize the distilling at Old Fitzgerald and build a new Bernheim distillery. The United Distillers hoped to capture the foreign markets with Old Fitzgerald, Rebel Yell, and W.L. Weller, and believed specifically that Rebel Yell could compete with Jack Daniels abroad and domestically. Within days of this announcement, Master Distiller Edwin Foote at Old Fitzgerald Distillery drastically ramped up production of wheated bourbon recipe to meet forecasts. Months later, United Distillers then purchased the Glenmore distilleries for $161 million. For Glenmore, which operated facilities in Louisville and Owensboro, the time was right to sell. Glenmore was the 8th largest distillery company, and United Distillers moved up to number 3. All actions suggested that the United Distillers would become a brilliant bourbon company when it launched Rebel Yell in Australia market with a $6 million ad budget, and publicly stated its plans to chip away at Jim Beam and Jack Daniels' Aussie market share. After all, it managed to sell 500,000 cases of I.W. Harper in Japan in 1991. But despite the investments and foreign momentum, United Distillers stopped distilling at Old Fitzgerald in 1992 and laid off 75 sales and marketing workers from the Owensboro operation. The company moved all distillation operations to the newly built Bernheim distillery with the same goal as before: make more Rebel Yell to compete with Jack Daniels. Just 4 years after it purchased the Owensboro plant, United Distillers sold the 2 former Glenmore distilleries and 37 brands to Barton for $171 million, saying the sale was a part of the global strategy to focus on Gordon's gin and vodka, Scoresby's scotch, and other premium brands. Despite this, they continued to distill large amounts of wheated bourbon at their Bernheim facility and aged this whiskey at former Stitzel-Weller Distillery, which was now known for its well-circulated warehouses. Over the course of the decade, United Distillers' American whiskey production and strategy created future stocks of Happy Van Winkle, Jefferson's, Willett, Cyrus Noble, and many other brands that did not have their own distilleries. Other brands took notice too, tasting the purchased stocks and deciding to increase their wheated bourbon production. Quote, "We were sitting in meetings going, 'That's not too shabby, and that's rather good. This wheat is quite something,' remembers Sazerac Mark Brown. Quote, 'It's quite a different whiskey. That whole project gave birth to the Antique Collection,' end quote. Both Heaven Hill and Barton brands would broker the former Old Fitzgerald and Glenmore whiskey stocks. At a time, you could buy a new fill barrel of Stitzel-Weller for $200. No existing distiller wanted older bourbon sitting in a warehouse. But the foreign demand was just enough of a good thing that new blood thought a trend could be in the works. Plus, the publicity had increased. Both Whiskey Magazine and Malt Advocate began covering bourbon whiskey, along with other whiskey types. Chuck Cowdery released a film on bourbon, and Gary Reagan published the book of Bourbon. All the while, Booker Noe and Jim Beam hit the pavement, trying to bring bourbon back to its former glory. Noe was educating the public about the nuances of bourbon like no one before. Quote, "A regular bourbon is made with good and bad whiskey to make it palatable," Noe told the Cincinnati Enquirer. "But there are no bad or immature whiskeys in small batch," end quote. Beam marketed its small batch collection of Booker's, Baker's, Basil Hayden, and Nom Creek, while Ancient Age promoted its collection of Blanton's, Rock Hill Farms, and Elmer T. Lee. Wild Turkey introduced Kentucky Spirit. The distilleries argued that the whiskey was getting better too, saying that this concentration on choice barrels yielded better bourbon. But that's the story they had to sell for the time. In fact, demand plummeted and they stopped producing large quantities of brands and gallons. A single barrel and small batch marketing initiatives were not last resort efforts by any means, but they were measures aimed at markets such as Japan and Australia. In fact, when the Nelson County Tourist Commission launched the Kentucky Bourbon Festival in 1991, it expressed a desire to make an international festival. The festival included a participation from most of the distilleries, but struggled to draw crowds. By 1998, though, the Kentucky Bourbon Festival's gala attracted 1,200 consumers from all over the world. That was enough for the LA Times to declare that bourbon was the drink of the decade. Perhaps this declaration was a little premature, but bourbon had life. For aspiring young businessman Trey Zeller, the slight growth and obvious interest in bourbon was enough for him and his father Chet to start the Jefferson's Reserve and Sam Houston brands. They bought leftover stocks from everybody they could, while others, such as Tom Bullitt, were establishing distillation contracts. These upstart brands were welcomed by distilleries sitting on large quantities of whiskey, much of which was left over from the United Distillers doings. Quote, people were thrilled to be able to get rid of their older whiskey from excess inventories, end quote, said Joe Mediocco, who resurrected the Pennsylvania Michter's brand with Kentucky whiskey in the early 1990s. Meanwhile, newer brands had their common mission to take away share from Maker's Mark. Blanton's held a Washingtonian magazine tasting in which Blanton's easily won. Makers later complained of Blanton's wax use, which led to Blanton's giving Maker's Mark a little taste of its own medicine with the full-page advertisement. If Maker's Mark has a monopoly on wax closures, maybe Buckingham Palace should turn its royal seal and switch to self-adhesive envelopes. Or could their sudden obsession with wax betray a more legitimate concern with whiskey? Funny how it all surfaced after we ran an ad describing 2 independent blind tastings in which Blanton's was clearly preferred to Maker's Mark. One taster called Blanton's more grown up and self-assured, while another found it softer, more consistently smoother, and ever so much more wonderful. Wax or no wax, it seems some people think Maker's Mark doesn't hold a candle to Blanton's. Maker's Mark then held a one-on-one duel in Louisville, where it easily won, and another blind tasting was months later. At the shot glass shootout in Lexington, Blanton's won again. Maker's came in a close second. Quote, it was a bad day, I guess, Maker's Mark Bill Samuels Jr. said. In a sense, it wasn't. This public feud was actually good for the category. If 2 brands claimed to be the best, the consumer had to try them both, and some might even ask, wait, what? Bourbon is good again? Jack Daniel's, a Tennessee whiskey, had enjoyed a lifetime of publicity with its connections to Frank Sinatra, who was known to consume a bottle or 2 of Jack Daniel's and then sing about it. Brown Foreman employed somebody whose sole job was keeping Sinatra stocked with Jack Daniel's, but not even old Blue Eyes could sustain the constant pressure Maker's Mark was putting on Jack Daniel's. The premise of Maker's Mark advertisement was basically to go as far as you could without getting sued. Bill Samuels Jr., a masterful marketer, signed a letter advertisement that read, quote, at first, I didn't believe myself. Not too long ago, I received a phone call from a woman in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, whose real name is Mrs. Jack Daniels. She told me that for years, and for obvious reason, the only whiskey her husband Jack Daniel would drink was the one with his name. Convinced her husband was too stubborn for his own good, Miss Daniel spent quite some time trying to get her husband to at least consider other brands. Finally, after years of prodding, Jack consented to give our whiskey a try. Now, according to Miss Daniel, Maker's Mark is the only whiskey Jack Daniel drinks. The advertisement included a tabloid with headlines of Jack Daniel drinks Maker's Mark. Jesse James found alive in Laredo, Kentucky. Melon-headed man speaks, alien Tom, and woman marries wild beast. You might think this would have been the straw that broke Brown Foreman's back, but it wasn't. According to a former Brown Foreman executive, Samuels Jr. invited members of the Brown family to a private party. Owsley Brown allegedly went to the party only to see that Samuels Jr. had hired the Jack Daniels band. According to this source, Brown returned from the party and told his executive team, "Somebody, please create a bourbon brand to compete with Maker's Mark." That brand, Brown-Forman denied that it was Maker's Mark pressure behind the creation of Woodford Reserve, but an internal memo indicates there might be some truth to the story of Woodford Reserve originating to, quote, compete with the likes of Maker's Mark, end quote. That was from the memo. Brown-Forman Master Distiller Chris Morris says that any such competitive mentions would have been for the benefit of tourists. Quote, Maker's Mark was really the only distillery doing anything, end quote. Nonetheless, Brown-Forman planned a distillery at the very site it once owned, LeBron Graham and Versailles in Woodford County. Nestled around seemingly endless bluegrass and horse farms, Woodford Reserve opened in 1996, and suddenly there was something to this bourbon uptick. Then more people came to the Kentucky Bourbon Festival, more distilleries added visitor experiences, and Kentucky was attempting to make something special. In 1999, the Kentucky Distillers Association created a brochure for the so-called Kentucky Bourbon Trail. The next year, it sent out a press release and a passport so consumers could get the experience stamp. It became an instant hit, albeit with some inside political scuffles. Buffalo Trace opted out of the KDA, but still claimed to be on the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, the KDA trademark. The KDA sued Buffalo Trace. Nonetheless, the signs were pointing toward bourbon's return to glory. At this point, sales were not what they once were, but the category's tourism and publicity indicated something special was happening. Whether by coincidence or strategy, distilleries began launching limited edition products around the same time, driving new interest with the likes of Evan Hills and Evan Williams, vintage single barrels, Buffalo Trace Antique Collection, and Jim Beam's Masterpiece series. By 1999, the industry still struggled, but an argument could be made that only a small percentage of bourbon distillers were even trying to improve their brand standings. Former president of the Kentucky Distillers Association, Frank Daly, said, "The larger companies, recognizing the problem of competition, own Scotch distilleries and wineries and produce vodka and gin because they see where the competition is, so they acquire product in that area." End quote. Perhaps the most disappointing distillery company from a bourbon perspective was Seagram. It was not placing stock in its bourbon distilleries. In fact, Joseph E. Seagram and Sons had closed numerous distilleries and was considering closing Four Roses in Lawrenceburg. In 1992, Jim Rutledge, who was the area administrative manager and barrel warehousing manager, saved Four Roses. Quote, Four Roses was contemplating contracting with another distillery and closing Four Roses, Rutledge remembers, because they were not happy with the quality coming out of the distillery. Quote, everybody's jobs were on the line, end quote. With each passing year under the control of Rutledge and distiller Ova Haney, the quality scored higher and higher until finally, quote, our corporate quality said we couldn't afford to close this distillery. The bourbon is too good. Rutledge attempted to buy Four Roses and campaigned for the brand's return. It had been exiled to foreign markets since the 1950s, and only Four Roses blended whiskey was sold in the United States. Four Roses Yellow Label quietly returned to Kentucky-only liquor store shelves in 1996 with two strong Seagram's caveats. No marketing dollars, end quote. We're only doing this so your employees can purchase it, end quote. At the timing could not have been better. Toward the end of the 1990s, internet forums, magazines, and fan clubs were centering around bourbon. People were falling in love with bourbon all over again. But it was a slow process, and as they say, timing is everything. Jim Beam launched the beautiful distiller's masterpiece, 20-year-old cognac bourbon finished in 1999. The packaging was beautiful and the whiskey was sublime, but the consumer base didn't understand the concept of finishing bourbon in a used cognac barrel. Had they just released the bourbon as a 20-year-old product, it likely would have caught fire. Around the same time, Papa Van Winkle, the brand, was beginning to get noticed. The Malt Advocate, now Whiskey Advocate, named Sazerac Rye and George T. Stagg World Whiskey of the Year in consecutive years in 2001 and 2002. Nobody knew that these limited edition products would be hits. Quote, "The antique collection was just a complete flop. And the deal with Diageo and looking at our own inventories, there were these odd pockets of old whiskey. If I had any wisdom, I'd have thought a hell of a lot more of it, but we took 20 barrels of this or 15 barrels of that or 30 barrels of that, and we said, we'll try a flyer. Let's put them out as an antique collection, because the Heritage Collection had been around, if you remember," Brown says, end quote. "We felt it would appeal to consumers at the premium of the marketplace," end quote. In addition to the birth of the limited edition products, bourbon started to show personality. The boisterous Booker Note paved the way for master distillers to speak about bourbon in open forums, while the eccentric Bill Samuels Jr. often offered flair and publicly complimented his competitors. Once hidden in yeast rooms and toiling with the still, late 1990s master distillers were getting outside their usual routines and spreading the gospel with their own styles. Wild Turkey's Jimmy Russell's Stick offered tongue-in-cheek comments about a Baptist minister inventing bourbon, and Scotch being good because it's aged in used bourbon barrels. Heaven Hill's Parker Beam offered the savant palate and knows with his boss Max Shapira that Parker can pull whiskey out of a barrel, rub it in between his hands, smell it, and know whether it's going to be good bourbon. Former Ancient Age master distiller Elmer T. Lee captured the room with his humble yet bigger-than-life presence. The avuncular Al Young, a longtime Seagram's employee, became an industry historian, and a soft-spoken Woodford Reserve master distiller Lincoln Henderson used Brown-Forman's Kentucky Derby to discuss the passion of bourbon. Quote, "I'd look at the color of each sample, sniff the aroma, and swish some of the product around in my mouth. Then I spit it out," Henderson told the Associated Press. The publicity bourbon received in the late 1990s was drastically different from the decade before. The 1980s were a time of hardship, eventual loss to vodka. Perhaps the industry could have spun it differently and shown the brighter side of bourbon, such as Blanton's Maker's Mark, but they could not hide from the slipping sales. The 1990s were a decade of hope and desire. The sales were often soft, depending on the brand, but those bourbon distillers who stuck their neck out and tested fate would be rewarded.